The storm found them first. It came from the southwest with no warning worth mentioning. A wall of black atmosphere that swallowed the horizon in 20 minutes flat and turned the ocean from blue-gray to the color of a bruise. Mara had been watching it from the rear of the inflatable tender since before the others noticed, her elbows on her knees and her chin in her hands, the way she always sat when something was wrong, and she didn't want to say so yet. She had her father's eyes for weather. He'd been a fishing trawler captain out of Galveston for 31 years, and he'd told her more than once that the ocean was not a place. It was a condition, and conditions changed. "We need to head in," she said. Cole was at the outboard. He had the throttle at a lazy quarter turn, and his shoes off, because he always took his shoes off when the sun was out, and the sun had been out 40 minutes ago. He looked back at her, then at the us guy, and his expression shifted the way a face shifts. When the body already knows something the brain hasn't caught up to yet. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, okay." There were 5 of them. Mara and Cole, who had been something close to a couple for 8 months without ever using that word. Raj, who was Cole's roommate, and who had brought 2 waterproof duffel bags of food and nothing else useful. Dee, who was pre-med, and who had so far spent the trip reading a battered paperback she'd found in the tender's storage compartment, left behind by whoever owned it before. And Bobby, who nobody had invited exactly, but who had attached himself to the group at the marina with the confident ease of a person who has never once considered that he might not be wanted. The storm caught them in 12 minutes. The outboard sputtered and died on the 3rd wave. They rowed. They took turns 2 at a time on the oars, the inflatable hull flexing in ways that felt deeply wrong, and Mara sat in the bow and watched the water and said nothing because there was nothing to say. The rain came sideways, the ocean rose and fell in long gray heaves. Bobby at one point said something meant to be funny, and nobody laughed and he didn't say anything else. Then Dee pointed. It was a ship. Not a large one by commercial standards, but large by every standard that mattered right now. A research vessel, maybe 60 meters. Sitting motionless on the water 200 meters off their port side, with all its running lights burning green-white in the dark. It shouldn't have been there. No vessel sits motionless in open water in a storm without reason, without anchor, without being underway or in distress. But it was there, and it was lit, and the 5 of them looked at it the way drowning things look at anything solid. Cole had the oars. He pulled them toward it without discussion. Getting aboard took the better part of an hour. There was a boarding ladder on the starboard side. Rubber-coated aluminum rungs, slick with spray, and they went up one at a time while the tender bucked and slapped against the hull below them. Mara went last. She secured the tender's line to the lowest rung and climbed and didn't look down. Because looking down in a situation like this accomplishes nothing and costs you something you might need later. The deck was empty. That was the first thing. Bone empty, not just quiet. The kind of empty that means no one has been here in a while, or that someone was here and then very suddenly wasn't. The winches were set and locked. A coffee mug sat in a drain channel near the stern, still upright, a dark stain ringing its interior where the liquid had evaporated over days or weeks. Raj found the jacket folded neatly over a railing cleat, and picked it up and looked at it and put it back down. "Hello," Bobby called. The ship said nothing except the wind. They went inside. The vessel's interior was warmer than it had any right to be. Powered by a generator whose low hum came up through the floor plates and into the soles of their feet. The corridors were narrow, and the lighting was automatic, sensors in the ceiling triggering amber panels as they moved. Someone had spent money on this ship, real money, the kind that buys custom fixtures and brushed steel paneling, and a galley that would not have looked out of place in a restaurant. But there was food in the refrigerator, going soft and mail on the table, and a calendar on the wall stopped at a date 3 weeks past. Raj found the wine rack. Cole found the radio, which was live but receiving only static on every frequency. Dee found the research lab. It was below decks, accessed through a hatch that had been left open, a detail that would bother Mara later, when she had time to bother about details. The lab was large for a vessel this size, occupying most of the lower deck. And it was not the clean, bright space of a university field station. It was a working lab, obsessively organized, with ample cases stacked floor to ceiling, and a row of sealed aquarium tanks along the port bulkhead, their water dark, their occupants not immediately visible. There were centrifuges and sequencers, and a spectrometer that probably cost more than the ship. There were 2 computer terminals, both active, both cycling through data loops that nobody had told to stop. And there were notes. Dee read them the way she read everything, quickly, and with her lips slightly parted and her head tilted to the right. Mara stood beside her and read over her shoulder and understood about a third of it. The rest she understood from context. The ship belonged to a marine biology team that had been studying a radioactive waste plume. Legacy contamination from a facility decommissioned 15 years ago, its records sealed, its operators long gone. The plume had seeded a section of the deep ocean with low-level ionizing radiation for long enough that things living in it had started to change. The plankton changed first. Then the small things that ate the plankton changed. Then the things that ate those things. What ate the plankton here were fish, not modern fish. The notes described them in careful scientific language that Dee translated as she went. Prehistoric species, thought extinct, persisting in the deep cold away from modern competition, now surfacing and mutating along pathways that made no evolutionary sense, but made terrible urgent sense as biology. They can breathe out of water, Dee said. She said it quietly, which was how she said things that frightened her. Mara looked at the tanks. The water in them was dark and still. Can they get out of the tanks? She asked. One of the tanks answered the question by being, when she looked more carefully, already open. The lid was off and lying on the floor 3 feet away, and the water level inside was 4 inches lower than it should have been. They found the survivor in the engine room. He was a man in his 60s, professor-shaped, with the specific dishevelment of someone who has been under severe stress for a long time and has stopped caring about surfaces. His name was Dr. Clark. He had been hiding in the engine room for 6 days, surviving on the water from a coolant system bypass he'd rigged with surgical tubing, eating protein bars from a case he'd dragged in with him. When they opened the engine room door, he looked up at them with the expression of a man who has already written himself off and is mildly surprised by the revision. There are more of you, he said. There are 5 of us, Mara said. That's not enough. He said it as a fact, not a cruelty. He told them what had happened in short sentences with long pauses between them, the way people tell things they've already told themselves many times and are tired of. The specimens had been growing. The mutation was accelerating in ways that defied the team's models. The fish were not just adapting physiologically, they were adapting behaviorally, becoming more aggressive, more coordinated, hunting in patterns that suggested something that ought not to be called intelligence, but was beginning to look like it. 2 weeks ago, one had gotten out of containment. It had killed the first team member in the lab. The others had tried to recapture it and failed, and then it had not been one anymore. How many now? Dee asked. Dr. Clark looked at the ceiling. When I stopped counting, 7. But that was before. Before what? Before they found each other. Mara was already doing the math. 5 people, a ship they didn't know the layout of. Creatures that could move on land. She used the word deliberately in her head. Creatures, because naming them accurately was important, that had killed an experienced team on their home ground. One survivor who was alive mostly because he'd found a good place to hide and had the presence of mind to stay in it. She looked at Cole. He was already looking at her. We need to find weapons, a life raft, and a way to signal for help, she said. In that order, the radio. The radio is getting nothing, maybe the antenna. There might be a satellite uplink in the lab. The lab is where? I know where the lab is. Bobby said, I'm not going back in the lab. Nobody told him he had to. The next hour was the most frightening thing Mara had ever done. And she had grown up on a fishing boat in the Gulf of Mexico and had twice seen what a storm surge does to coastline up close. It was frightening not because of the things they encountered. They didn't encounter anything, not at first, but because of the quality of the silence. The ship made sounds, the generator, the hull flexings in the swell, water and pipes. But underneath those sounds was a different kind of quiet, the quiet of large things moving carefully. And she heard it in her body before she heard it with her ears. Cole found a flare gun in the bridge emergency locker. Raj found a fire axe in a corridor bracket. Dee found a harpoon gun in the equipment locker, spring-loaded, designed for specimen collection, single shot, powerful enough to put a bolt through 12 inches of hardwood. Mara found the satellite uplink terminal and spent 8 minutes convincing it to find a signal through the storm. She composed a distress message in 43 words, attached the vessel's GPS coordinates, and set it to broadcast on repeat on the international emergency frequency. Whether anyone would receive it, and whether they would receive it in time, were questions she put in a separate mental compartment and closed the lid on. She was doing this, composing the message, fingers moving on the keyboard with the particular steadiness she'd learned from her father, who'd told her once that your hands are calmer than you are if you let them be. When she heard Bobby shout from 2 decks below, it was not a shout of surprise, it was the other kind. She found the axe in Raj's hands and took it. The creature that had gotten Bobby was still in the lounge when she arrived. She registered it in pieces rather than all at once, the way the mind protects itself. Scales, matte gray-black, not reflective the way fish scales usually are. A body that was wrong in the way a thing is wrong when evolution has been compressed by force into years instead of millennia. Too long in some joints, too short in others, bent along axes that didn't correspond to any body plan she recognized. It moved on 4 limbs but not the way a 4-limbed thing moves. It moved the way water moves around an obstacle, finding paths rather than forcing them. Its eyes were anterior-facing and too large, the pupils horizontal, and they tracked her when she entered the room with an attention that was worse than mindless aggression. Bobby was down. She didn't look at Bobby. She looked at the creature. It looked back. There was a moment. She would think about this moment for a long time afterward, where neither of them moved. She was aware of her own breathing, of the axe handle against her palms, of the ship moving under her feet in the long, slow rhythm of the swell. She was aware that the thing across the room from her was conducting some version of the same assessment. And she was aware that it had already killed several people who were smarter, better equipped, and more knowledgeable than her about what it was. She also became aware in this moment of something the creature's designers, the blind, patient engineers of radiation and time, had not accounted for. She was angry. Not the hot, disorganizing anger that makes people stupid, the cold, clarifying kind. The kind her father had called working anger. The anger that comes from having something worth protecting and knowing the distance between you and it is exactly the length of your arms. She threw the axe, not at the creature, at the tank of fire pressant mounted on the wall behind it. The bracket split. The tank hit the floor and discharged in a white chemical cloud that filled half the lounge in 3 seconds. The creature reacted to it. Reacted violently, lurching away from the cloud in a motion that was almost a convulsion. Scrambling for the door with none of the controlled predatory grace it had shown a moment before. It did not like the suppressant. She filed that. She grabbed Bobby's arm. He was conscious, barely, one hand pressed to his side where the thing had gotten him. And she got him to his feet with the particular combination of strength and urgency that you don't know you have until you need it, and she moved him out of the lounge and into the corridor and pulled the door shut behind them. Cole was in the corridor, so was Dee. Raj was behind them. "Where's it going?" Cole asked. "Away," Mara said. For now, she looked at Dee. "Bobby needs, I see it." Dee was already beside him, hands moving. "It's not as bad as it looks. Maybe. Can he move?" "He can move." Dr. Clark had appeared at the far end of the corridor. He looked at Bobby, then at the closed lounge door, then at Mara, with the expression of someone recalibrating rapidly. "You drove it off," he said. "I got lucky. My team for 2 weeks to drive them off." He paused. "What did you use?" "Fire suppressant." His eyes changed. "The Halon system." He said it slowly, like a man who has just remembered something he should have remembered 6 days ago. "The ship has a Halon suppression system. Automated, tied to the smoke detectors." He looked at the ceiling. "If we could trigger it ship-wide, would that kill them?" "I don't know." "The biochemistry." "Yes, the Halon would displace oxygen in enclosed spaces. If they breathe the same air we do, and the evidence strongly suggests they do then we'd need breathing equipment. There's diving gear in the equipment locker." Mara looked at Cole. 3 sets, Cole said. He'd checked. Cole always checked things, quietly, and mentioned them when they became relevant. It was one of the things she valued about him. 5 people, she said. 3 sets of full rebreathers. 2 sets of lightweight snorkel gear that probably won't cut it for a Halon discharge. She thought about this for 4 seconds, which was how long she permitted herself to think about tactical problems before moving to the next phase. "Where's the Halon control panel?" "Bridge," Dr. Clark said. "Manual override. And the creatures, where do they tend to be?" "The lab, mostly. The lower corridors near the lab. They're comfortable in the water. They return to the tanks sometimes, I think, for temperature reasons." "The lab is below decks," Mara said. "If we seal the hatches between decks before triggering the Halon system, you'd concentrate the discharge on the lower level." Dr. Clark was nodding. "Flood the lower deck with Halon, seal it off. Anything down there. Ds or retreats, yes. But you said some of them are on the upper decks. At least 2, based on the sounds." She looked at her team. Cole, who was steady and did not panic. Dee, who was kneeling beside Bobby, and whose hands were steady even when her voice wasn't. Raj, who was frightened in a visible way, but who had not yet done anything stupid, which was its own kind of useful. Bobby, who was hurt and pale and breathing through his nose in the short, careful way of someone managing pain. Bobby stays here, she said. Dee stays with him. She looked at Dee. You're watching the corridor behind us, the flare gun. I have it, Dee said. She did. She'd picked it up somewhere without being asked. The suppressant drove it off once. If another one comes, I'll make noise. I'll buy time. Don't be a hero. I'm pre-med, not stupid. But she almost smiled when she said it, and Mara almost smiled back, and it was the most human 12 seconds of the whole night. Mara took the remaining rebreather. Cole took one. Raj took the third, with hands that were not as steady as they could be, but steadier than they'd been 20 minutes ago. And that was the direction that mattered. Dr. Clark had no rebreather, but he knew the ship and he had been surviving on it for 6 days, and he led them back through the corridors toward the lower deck hatches, with the quiet efficiency of a man who has mapped every inch of his prison. They sealed the hatches. It took 12 minutes and cost them one encounter, a creature in the forward corridor that came at them from the left, and stopped when Mara put herself between it and the others, and held the axe across her body and did not move. It was a bluff. It was the most obvious bluff she'd ever run, and she had no idea if it would work, because she had no idea how these things processed threat assessment. But it stopped. It circled, and while it was circling, Cole got the hatch sealed behind them. She thought, whatever their designers built into them, they didn't build in certainty. They didn't build in the thing that makes a predator finish what it started regardless of cost. They build into the thing that keeps animals alive, the calculation of risk. And humans, she thought, had spent 10,000 years learning to look more dangerous than they are. The hatch sealed with a resonant clang that she felt in her back teeth. Then they went to the bridge. The bridge was dark except for instrument glow, green and amber panels, the radar screen showing a clear ocean around them, the GPS pulsing steadily. The Halon control panel was on the starboard bulkhead, exactly where Dr. Clark said it would be, a red-framed cabinet with a key switch and a manual trigger, and a status display showing system pressure in the green. The key was in the switch. The previous crew had planned to use it, and then hadn't gotten the chance. Cole got the rebreather on Raj and checked the seals, then got his own on. Mara had already fitted hers. Clark stood to the side and looked at the panel with the expression of a man making peace with something. You should have one of the snorkel masks at least, she told him. It won't help with Halon. You know that. It'll buy seconds. I've had enough seconds. Trigger it. She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned the key and hit the trigger. The Halon system on a vessel this size was not dramatic. There was no explosion, no cloud of visible gas. There was a deep pressure change that she felt in her ears, and a series of mechanical sounds from below. Valves opening, lines pressurizing, and then a low hiss that rose and fell and settled into the background like a new tone of the ship's breathing. The status panel showed deck indicators going from green to amber to red. Lower deck, red. Aft lower red, lab section red. Then the sound started. She had been expecting something, but not this. It was not a sound of distress exactly. It was too non-human for that. But it was an urgent sound. A sound that carried information about things that were moving fast in spaces that were no longer hospitable to them. She heard impacts against the sealed hatches. Not the measured exploratory testing she might have expected, but something harder and more desperate. And she held herself steady against the bridge station with both hands, and did not look at the hatches, because looking at them would not help. And what she needed now was to watch the status panel. One hatch held, then the second, then the sounds from below became less frequent. Then they became occasional, then they stopped. What remained above them was a different problem. She'd known this from the moment she outlined the plan, had held it in the same compartment as the unanswered questions about the distress signal, kept it there so it didn't interfere with the steps that had to happen first. 2 creatures on the upper decks, according to Dr. Clark's best estimate. The Halon hadn't touched them. They were somewhere on this ship with 3 people in rebreathers, and an old man who'd refused the snorkel mask and was now showing the particular stillness of a man who is conserving oxygen by not moving. Stay here, she told Cole. Watch the door, Mara. I know the suppressant works. I know the layout now. And there are 2 of them, which means splitting them is better than bunching up. He looked at her the way he sometimes looked at her when she said things he disagreed with, but could not argue against. Take the axe. I'm going to need both hands. She looked around the bridge. Her eyes stopped on a fire extinguisher in the corner. CO2, not halon, but a pressurized chemical delivery system in a handheld format. She picked it up. She weighed it. She looked at the axe. She took both. The upper deck was 3 corridors and a stairwell. She worked it like her father had taught her to work a new dock in a new port. Methodically, with patience, never assuming the next space was safe just because the last one was. She found the first creature in the galley. It had been eating something she didn't look at closely enough to identify, and it turned when she came through the doorway, with the focused immediacy of a thing that does not experience surprise. She put the CO2 extinguisher between them and discharged it at full volume. It was loud. Louder than she'd expected, a sound like compressed atmosphere meeting resistance, and the creature flinched from it. Not from the chemical, not like the halon, but from the noise and the force and the cold. She watched it orient, watched it process, watched the horizontal pupils track from the extinguisher to her face and back. And she watched the decision form behind those eyes, the ancient animal calculus. Cost versus benefit, danger versus reward. It retreated. She let it go. She found the second one on the rear deck, which meant it had come topside through a vent she hadn't known about, which was a structural vulnerability she couldn't do anything about now. It was larger than the others, or seemed so in the dark, in the rain that was still coming, lighter now, the storm beginning its long withdrawal. It was at the stern rail, and when she came through the deck hatch, it turned toward her with a slowness that was not the slowness of hesitation. She was 12 feet away. She thought about her father, not in a dramatic way. The way you think about a person whose way of being in the world has become part of your own way. So integrated you sometimes don't notice it until a moment requires it. He had told her, when you're 12 feet from something that can hurt you, the distance is exactly right. Close enough to not miss. Far enough to have a second if the first doesn't work. She discharged the extinguisher at the creature's face. It reared back. She moved left, fast, to the equipment locker beside the hatch. Inside was a specimen net, steel-framed on a long handle, designed to capture things that didn't want to be captured. She brought it out, and when the creature came forward again, she brought the frame across its lateral line, the sensory organ running along the flank, with everything she had. The effect was immediate and total. The creature convulsed. It didn't fall, but it lost coordination, in the way a thing loses coordination when you've struck the wrong nerve. And in the 2 seconds that bought her, she got to the stern rail and picked up a coil of rope, and did what her father had taught her to do with rope, which was something between a lasso and a harness, thrown fast, without looking at her hands. The rope went around the base of the creature's forelimb. She pulled. She had the cleat. She had the leverage. The creature was strong, stronger than her by an order of magnitude that she felt in every muscle of her shoulders and back. But it was fighting something it didn't understand, and she was fighting something she did. And she put her feet against the cleat mount, and she pulled and it moved, and she wrapped the line twice and tied it off in a knot. Her father had shown her at age 9 and said, if you learn nothing else on this boat, learn this. Because a good knot is the difference between going home and not going home. The creature was secured. It was not immobilized. It would work free, given time, and the rope would give before the biology did. But it was secured for long enough, which was all she'd needed it to be. She stood in the rain on the deck of a stranger's ship, and breathed and let her heartbeat finish its conversation with her ribs. Cole was at the hatch. She had not heard him come. Raj is watching the bridge hatches, he said. Dr. Clark he's down. He said it carefully, not making it worse by inflection. He sat down and he's not getting up again. I think it's the halon. He was in that lab a long time. His lungs. She looked at the secured creature, which was working at the rope with focused attention, and she thought about the things she had used, and the things she had left, and the people below, and the man who had survived 6 days alone with these things, and then died from the thing that saved them. Distress signals been broadcasting for 90 minutes, she said. If anyone's in range. Then they're coming. She looked at the horizon. The storm was clearing from the east, pulling back its gray curtain to show a dark sky, beginning to remember that it had stars. We hold the upper deck. We hold the bridge. We give them something to find. And if they're not in range, then we use the tender and we row until we are. Cole looked at her for a moment. He had known her for 8 months, which is long enough to know a person, but not always long enough to know what they're made of. She thought he might be updating something. Okay, he said. Okay, they went inside. Dee had gotten Bobby stabilized. His color was coming back, a small mercy, and he was conscious enough to complain about the smell of the halon venting up through the deck plates, which she took as a good sign. Raja was at the bridge station doing something with the communications array that looked like it might eventually result in something useful. The distress message was still cycling, the GPS was still pulsing. They held the ship for 6 hours. It was not 6 comfortable hours. The creature she'd secured on the stern worked free after 40 minutes, which she'd expected, and she tracked its movements through the deck-level viewports as it circled the upper superstructure. It did not try to get back in. She had no clean theory for why, only observations. The encounters with the extinguisher, the net, the rope, the noise. Each one was a piece of information that updated something in the creature's assessment. It was learning, which was what its makers had built into it. But it was learning that this group of organisms on this ship was expensive in ways that other prey had not been. And the thing about an animal that has learned to calculate costs is that it can learn that some costs are not worth paying. The second creature, the one that had retreated from the galley, also stayed away. She saw it once through a bridge porthole, moving along the hull below the waterline with a fluid efficiency that made her understand, viscerally, why the original crew had never managed to recapture it. In the water, it was something else entirely. On the ship's decks and corridors, it was formidable. In the ocean, it was sovereign. She was glad for the halon-sealed lower deck, glad for the meters of steel between the water and where her people were. Her people. She noticed herself thinking that and didn't correct it. Bobby slept. Dee dozed beside him with the flare gun in her lap. Raj maintained the radio with the particular obsessive focus of someone who needs to be doing something. Cole sat near Mara and did not try to talk, which was exactly right. She found around the 3rd hour a logbook, not the ship's official log. That was in the bridge and she'd already checked it. But a personal one, cloth-covered, the handwriting inside small and angled, belonging to someone who'd been with the research team for 3 years. She read it in pieces, between patrols of the upper deck, and it told her things that the official notes hadn't. The specimens had not just mutated. They had changed in ways that the team's instruments could measure, but their frameworks couldn't explain. The neural density increasing faster than the musculature could follow. The sensory apparatus developing new structures, with no analogs in modern fauna. The behavioral patterns becoming less reflexive and more deliberate in ways that had nothing to do with the feeding or territorial programming you'd expect. The last entry, written 2 days before the date on the calendar, said only, "We have been thinking about this wrong. They aren't adapting to live alongside us. They are adapting to live without us. Whatever we are to them, they are learning to make us irrelevant." She sat with that for a while. Then she went back to watching the horizon, where the sky was getting lighter in the east, and thought about what it means to be relevant. The signal came at dawn. Not a response to the distress broadcast, something more immediate, a light on the water, rhythmic, the sweep of a searchlight. A Coast Guard cutter, running hard, its bow throwing white water in the early morning calm after the storm. Someone had received the broadcast. Someone had acted on it. There is a system, and the system sometimes works. And when it works, it sends something like this. 80 feet of steel and personnel and light moving toward you at 22 knots with purpose. She fired the flare gun from the bridge wing, 3 times, high and wide, because 3 is the international distress pattern, and some signals are worth making correctly. The searchlight found them, held them, moved. The cutter was alongside in 20 minutes, its crew efficient and professional in the way of people who have done difficult things many times and know how to do them without drama. A paramedic was over the rail and down to Bobby before Mara had finished the initial briefing with the cutter's officer. A woman about her own age, short and steady-eyed, who listened without interrupting and asked 3 questions at the end. The creatures are still aboard, 2 on the upper deck. Estimated 7 or more on the lower deck, sealed in with halon. The halon will clear. They'll have mobility again. I know. How long to get my people transferred? 20 minutes. The creatures won't move on the upper deck in daylight. I've observed that. I can't explain it, but it held for the 6 hours we were here. She paused. Don't send your people below. Not until you have equipment I can't give you a list of right now. The officer looked at her for a moment. You're not crew. No. You held this vessel for 6 hours. We had limited options. Most people with limited options don't hold vessels for 6 hours. She said it without particular warmth, but without its opposite either. It was simply an accurate statement, made by someone who appreciated accuracy. Transfer your people. I'll handle the rest. Mara crossed to the cutter with Cole at her side, and Raj behind them and two cutter crew helping Bobby on a stretcher. She went over the rail last and stood at the stern, and watched the research vessel sitting in the morning light, with its running lights still burning. The ocean around it flat and quiet after the storm. The sky above it, the particular blue that comes after bad weather, has finished with an area and moved on. Somewhere inside it, things that should not exist were moving in sealed darkness, waiting, or the closest thing to waiting that their new minds could manage, for the Halen to clear and the hatches to weaken, and the opportunity to reassert what they believed was a settled matter. She thought about the logbook, about the last entry, about the word irrelevant. She thought about 5 people in an inflatable tender who had found a ship in a storm and had decided, for no reason that could be called tactical, to go aboard and look. About Dee reading notes in the dark. About Cole checking inventory without being asked. About Raj at the radio. About Bobby, who nobody had invited but who had come anyway, which was its own kind of human stubbornness. About Dr. Clark, who had survived 6 days and shared what he knew and died from the thing that saved the others, and whose knowledge was now part of what kept those others breathing. About how you make something relevant. It is not the size of what you are. The creatures below were larger, stronger, faster, adapted to an environment that humans had to armor themselves to enter. They were the product of processes millions of years older than the species standing on this deck. They had every physical advantage and were shaped for exactly this: open ocean, enclosed spaces, ambush, attrition. But they had not counted on the particular stubbornness of a species that ties knots, that reads notes left by strangers and understands them and uses them. That maps unfamiliar corridors in the dark, not because it is brave, but because doing nothing felt worse. That calculates odds and works the math, and then does the thing anyway because the alternative is not surviving, and not surviving has never been acceptable to the strange, loud, improbable animal that crawled out of the mud 10 million years ago and has been refusing to go back ever since. Irrelevant. She watched the vessel until the cutter had established a perimeter, and the ship's boarding party was being assembled with proper equipment and clear protocols and everything that her night had lacked. She watched the running lights still burning against the morning. Then she turned around and went to find her people. Bobby was in the cutter's small medical bay with Dee beside him and a paramedic on the other side. And his color was good now, actually good. And he looked up when she came through the hatch and said, "So, you stopped a fish from eating the boat." Something like that. You know what the difference is between an HFY moment and a fish story? Don't. The fish story has better punchlines. He winced when he laughed, but he laughed. She sat on the bench across from him and leaned her head back against the bulkhead and closed her eyes for the first time in 9 hours. The cutter moved under her in long, easy swells, the ocean reverting to its ordinary business now that the storm had passed. Cole sat beside her. She felt him there without opening her eyes. The particular quality of his stillness, which she had learned to recognize. "Your father would have handled that better," Cole said. He meant it as a compliment. "My father would have handled it differently," she said. Same result. You think she thought about the knot, the fire suppressant. The CO2 extinguisher swung like a lantern in the dark. The logbook, the 6 hours, the flare. "Yeah," she said. Same result. Outside, the sun was fully up now, cutting hard and low across the ocean, the kind of light that makes the water look like hammered bronze. Somewhere behind them, the research vessel sat in it, waiting for people with better equipment and clearer orders to come and deal with what was inside it. That was their problem now, and she was glad to give it to them. Hers was done. Not neatly, not cleanly, Doctor. Clark was gone, and Bobby would carry a scar, and none of them would sleep well for a while. But, done. And that was the word she held on to, the one she kept returning to in the weeks afterward, when the nightmares came, and the interviews with the government people who wouldn't say exactly who they worked for, came and the quiet afterwards came. Done. Not because the threat was over. Not because the ocean had been made safe, or the contamination had been reversed, or the creatures below the surface had been cataloged and neutralized by people in the right agencies with the right resources. Not because the calculus had shifted permanently in any direction, but because 5 people had gone out on the water in an inflatable boat on a sunny day and found something that wanted to unmake them, and they had chosen, collectively and without a plan, to decline. That was what her father had taught her. Not seamanship, not navigation. Not the knot, though the knot had saved her life. He had taught her the declination, the refusal, the specific human habit of looking at the thing that wants to end you and saying, "Not today." Not because you know you'll win. Because you always try anyway. The cutter ran northwest toward the Florida coast, and the sun climbed, and the ocean behind them went about its ancient business, and Mara slept.